Welcome back to the Majority Report. I'm Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Kayvon Afshari. He is the Director of Communications at the American Iranian Council. He's also the host of the Mideast show. And I need to say, by a full disclosure here, one of my other gigs is I am a research analyst, senior research analyst at the American Iranian Council. So in addition to being friends, which I guess is typical for many people I interview, we're also colleagues. So with that out of the way, Kayvon, thanks so much for joining us today.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. Sam's playing golf again today, isn't he?
Sam is not athletic enough for golf, but if you were kind of implying, the certain maybe a laziness, that is true.
That's what I was getting at.
Yeah. No, he's actually, Sam is on his way to a well-earned vacation.
And good for him.
Yeah, as is Matt. Matt has this whole made-up baby story going on, so he's been stringing days off. So
you're running the show yourself.
Whatever. I can carry the mantle. It's fine.
Right.
I'm the one who's fueled up with kombucha and yoga, so I'm good to go. Look, so Kayvon, the deadline keeps being extended at these negotiations between the P5+1 and Iran. It seems to me that there's a lot of, these are nuclear negotiations. These are not full scale, the relations between Iran and America, the relations between Iran and America and its neighbors. This is not, there are a lot of other variables in the Iran and U.S. relationship, but fundamentally, it seems that the negotiations, that there seems to be this kind of ongoing injection of other issues into them in order to sort of complicate the process. So what I'm wondering is, we're seeing the extensions of the deadline continue to be extended. President Obama apparently has told an ally of his in the Senate that he is less optimistic now. That was reported this morning about reaching a deal. So what's going on in your view? Is it that we have an actual bottleneck on the technical questions that they're dealing with? These are highly technical negotiations about a nuclear program, right? So is the problem that, or are we getting into other issues about sanctions, about conventional arms, that are kind of muddying the waters as both sides, well, not just both sides, I guess several sides work towards an agreement here? What's your read on it?
Well, I think you're right that this is constrained specifically to the nuclear issue. It would, however, just as kind of a side note, I think concluding a deal would definitely have some reverberations, positive reverberations for broader U.S.-Iran relations, because it will have, pretty much for the first time in 35 years, set a precedent by which, a diplomatically negotiated settlement managed to peacefully resolve a very thorny, decade-long international issue.
Definitely.
And thus, because of that precedent being set, there is room for the U.S. and Iran to negotiate on other issues in which they both have a stake, all related to the security of the Middle East and North Africa. And that's something that I am in favor of seeing these two sides work together towards regional peace. On the issue of what the bottlenecks are here, I think you're right also that it is, my sense is that they're dealing with highly technical issues here, and that is what's causing the consistent delays. And I'm watching it on Twitter now, because there's a bunch of journalists at the hotel where they're negotiating, and it seems like, yes, they won't conclude it today. They went back into another meeting another hour ago or so, but it's looking like it's not going to be concluded today. But this is a really important point. If we're starting from the point that, it probably is technical issues that are in the way and both sides do want a deal, then it's more important. Then I'm not too concerned about a deadline being extended for another day or another week, because it's more important that they achieve perfect clarity in the negotiation phase, rather than during the implementation phase have some disagreement. Because if they don't achieve that perfect clarity on these highly technical issues now or next week or in the next 2 weeks, and the two sides walk away with slightly different interpretations, that's going to leave too much room for one side to accuse the other of abrogating that agreement, which could lead the whole thing to fall apart. So I think it's fine. I think they should just keep on negotiating. You know, it'd be great if it's announced today, but if it's announced next week, that's fine as well. The other issues, so I think that's the primary bottleneck. I think the rest of it, like the domestic politics in the U.S., domestic politics in Iran, the other regional players are definitely a factor involved, but I don't believe that those factors, while significant, are enough to stop the U.S. and Iran and the other partners at the table from achieving what they want to do. They have to certainly, like Obama has to take Congress into consideration, but ultimately the U.S. and Iran and the other partners, I think, have invested so much political capital in this process that it would be such a failure for them to just walk away from it.
Right, and that's actually the natural follow-up question. I want to get into the domestic politics. I think we'll get into a little bit in the U.S., but actually we should get into it inside Iran because that's talked about less, and that's pretty fascinating and important. And you know, Rouhani is dealing with his own hardliners in pursuing this course. But that said, you know, it does seem to me that there's so many paradoxes of these negotiations. You know, I was talking with Ali Gareb a couple of probably about 6 weeks ago, a couple months ago on this program, and I was saying, you know, there's an extraordinary paradox of, on one hand, people talking about Iran as if it's the moral and political equivalent of ISIS, and then at the same time, you're seeing pictures clicked of
Netanyahu.
Netanyahu said that.
I was just going to say Netanyahu's making that point exactly.
That's the main sort of silly PR tactic from Netanyahu, which actually really is frankly, I would think that Israel's PR people could do better than that. But at any rate, you know, there's something that's so just sort of a performative contradiction of that talking point, that silliness, and then, you know, pictures of Kerry and Zarif, you know, walking around Switzerland together. It's ridiculous. So not that Iran, and not that there aren't very big differences, and not that Iran doesn't have many problems, and not that it's a rosy picture by any stretch of the imagination, but obviously it's not ISIS. That's ludicrous. So I guess the kind of follow-up question to that, and reflecting what you said before in terms of all the political capital that's been expended in these negotiations, is it more that, you know, while this particular configuration is in place, well, basically you have Obama, you have Rouhani, and and we'll get to it more later, but clearly the supreme leader of Iran, Khamenei, has obviously signed off on this strategy, regardless of whatever rhetorical, you know, sort of bombast he engages in. He clearly supports Rouhani and Zarif in this. It seems that as long as this arrangement is in place, you know, how do you step back from this? Are you just, you know, it seems to me that next week, or all of a sudden the U.S. and Iran just going to go back to, we hate each other and this is done and all of these negotiations and breakthroughs were irrelevant. That seems ridiculous. So what it seems like is, and I want to, you know, get your take on this. Obviously, the sooner the better, but really you're in a situation right now where if you kind of freeze time for another several months or a year, under this particular configuration, they're going to keep looking for a way to get to yes. And the danger is more, what happens if it doesn't happen, and then we have a political shift in the United States and or Iran.
Exactly. And this is, I think, basically the timeline here. First, I should say this early. I do think that they will reach a deal, by the way. It's not going to be today. It may be next week or 2 weeks, but I do think that they will reach a deal soon. I think the timeline on this basically runs until the end of the Obama presidency. I mean, he still has, you know, a year and a couple months. I guess January 2017 would be the inauguration of a new president. So there is still time, and I think as long as Obama's in office, has his cabinet, and John Secretary is still serving as Secretary of State alongside Wendy Sherman and the rest of the team, I think that healthy deadline is still in place.
Okay, so let's move then to.
But you asked about Iran too, and I should comment on that as well.
Yeah,
so,
I want to move there. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll get. So you're right that Khamenei has endorsed these. He said that he's publicly kind of pessimistic about it, which I think is kind of a shrewd strategy because if it falls apart, he can say he was pessimistic from the beginning.
Right.
But Zarif and Rouhani have totally expended their political capital on this. I mean, Rouhani made it kind of a point in his domestic agenda that he wants to finally resolve this issue. There are, of course, detractors in Iran, and these are, I refer to them as the revolutionaries. So these are the people in Iran who, and they don't like Zarif. When they summon him to the Majlis, which is Iran's parliament, they don't have very nice things to say about him for negotiating with what they refer to as the Great Satan.
Right.
Now, this bloc inside of Iran, they basically believe in the principles fundamentally of the Islamic Revolution, and all of those principles, as you know, are enshrined in their document, the Constitution for the Islamic Republic. And in that Constitution, there are several principles that I think it's hard for them to reconcile those principles with reaching a negotiated settlement with the so-called Great Satan. So, for example, and I think your listeners should actually take a quick look at the Constitution because they list scientific self-sufficiency as one of those principles, and the nuclear program would fall under that. Of course, they list neither East nor West, meaning that the Islamic Revolution took place at the height of the Cold War, and so they didn't want to ally with the communist bloc nor with the West, but rather to pave their own way. And then thirdly, I would say kind of they believe in this principle of standing up for the rights of oppressed peoples, and they view through this lens, they view the United States as an imperial power, and thus they're extremely suspicious of the United States, which makes it difficult for them to understand or to endorse negotiating with this power. And I mean, unfortunately, over the past 35 years, there have been many instances in which that worldview becomes validated. Really unfortunate circumstances. I'll just quickly name a few of them, but like the downing of the Iranian airliner in 1988, 8 years of support for Saddam Hussein. Even today, on the nuclear issue, we saw for years before the latest round of negotiations started, we saw at least 3 Iranian scientists assassinated, a 4th attack. We saw Iranian military sites attacked, cyber warfare. So this confirms that worldview for them. Of course, conversely, for the United States, they view Iran naturally as a very anti-American revolutionary power. And so it's everything from the hostage crisis to attacking American soldiers in Iraq that confirms their worldview. So there is this process of kind of reconciling one's lens with which Iran views the U.S. and the U.S. views Iran, and reconciling that with a negotiated settlement to the nuclear issue. That's how I see it.
Right, and I think that, and I actually would love you to kind of get into it a little bit more in terms of domestic Iranian politics, because it's very fascinating and sort of important to tease out a little bit. So, what it seems, because obviously even the quote unquote moderate factions in Iran, led by President Rouhani and Minister Zarif, they would certainly allow no one to question their revolutionary bona fides, right? So all of this takes place in the context of we are, fully paid up members of the Islamic Revolution, and in fact, I think it's quite clear that one of the reasons, just to give some history here, in the late 1990s, the Iranian people elected President Khatami president, right? This was a guy who really was, again, a full-fledged member of the Islamic Revolution, part of the leadership. But he was, I would go so far as to say, really like a liberal leader, and had a very deep reformist leader. He had really interesting notions about a kind of global dialogue of civilizations, and he was not trusted by the Iranian establishment, and he basically was marginalized. They were both afraid of him because of his immense popular support, which reflected desire for change in Iran. And he was even put in situations where apparently associates and people close to him were had their human rights violated, maybe even killed by Iranian security services, and he couldn't even intervene and help them. The point being that, and then we went through the Ahmadinejad years, and he actually fell out with the supreme leader when he sort of went out and sort of strutted too much, and
That's right.
and kind of actually really tried to almost assert himself as almost more of just sort of a populist authoritarian type leader and not a loyal president in the Islamic Republic, which is fascinating and a little bit different from how he's perceived in the West. But with
That's
Rouhani,
right.
you have a guy who is totally trusted by the establishment and very validated by them, but who also is a genuine, has reformist inclinations, but maybe more of a realist reformist. So I
I
guess
would say,
how
yeah.
are
I mean,
those guys framing themselves in terms of counteracting the attack they're getting from the right, um, in terms of solidifying their bona fides while they pursue this course of negotiations?
yeah. So I think on Rouhani, he's not quite a reformist. More the term that is used to describe him is more a moderate or
Mm,
a pragmatist. Because
right,
reformist, at least in Iranian politics, means a really specific thing that you're aligned with Khatami and the movement that he started. But that's
right.
kind of just a small technical point. But
No,
um,
that's important. No,
yeah,
it's
I mean,
interesting. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, no, but I
yeah.
think important. Well, so I think for on Rouhani, I mean, he served for years on the Supreme National Security Council, and
Right.
that is very close to Ayatollah Khamenei. So you're right that in terms of his revolutionary bona fides, he has something specific that he can point to. And I think that in terms of selling this, you asked about selling this deal to the hardline, the detractors in Iran, those who are against the deal. And there are plenty of them. I mean, you can look at the IRGC leader,
Right.
Mohammad Ali Jafari, and some of his colleagues, one of the main writers for the Iran's hardline newspaper, Kayhan, his name's Hossein Shariat Madari. He's against it as well. And I think the way that they are selling it is by arguing that Rouhani and Zarif are selling it is telling them that this is ultimately good for the Islamic Republic. And this gets to a concept that Ayatollah Khamenei talked about in September 2013, just before the JPOA, the Joint Plan of Action, came out on the nuclear issue.
Right.
And he referred to something called heroic flexibility. And what that means is that he was saying that the Islamic Republic needs to show heroic flexibility in order to get to this, to achieve this nuclear deal. And what he meant by that is that basically it's kind of there should be a tactical change, meaning that they should make this deal because it's good for the Islamic Republic, but not lose sight of their view of the U.S. as this, what they think is as an imperial power, basically, but to maintain their suspicion, to be vigilant of U.S. designs for the region, or what they perceive as U.S. Intentions for regime change in the country, but that if there can be a change in tactics and to get this nuclear deal, it's good for the Islamic Republic, basically for two reasons. First, because what they get in return is sanctions relief, and they have been living under sanctions for a very long time. And those sanctions really were ratcheted up under President Obama, who passed the CISADA, the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Divestment Act, as well as the multilateral sanctions that came through the UN were under Obama as well. That really ratcheted up. On that point, I don't think that's why this round is successful, and we can come back to that. But it is certainly something that they want, is to have sanctions removed. And secondly, I think to kind of lower the temperature and their threat perception of the United States, because again, whether you're a reformist or a moderate or a pragmatist or a revolutionary hardliner in Iran, all of them view the United States suspiciously in terms of its designs for the region, and believe that it's interested in overthrowing their prized Islamic revolution.
Right. Although, again, and this is actually where maybe before we move towards the conclusion, let's talk about some of the quote unquote side issues. And the reason I do call them, side issues to a degree is because obviously everything is in play in these negotiations, from the future of the relationship between the U.S. and Iran to, the nature of our policies in the Middle East, United States policies in the Middle East, to Iran's perception of the West. All of that is in play. But I do think it's important to really always disaggregate and make that distinction. Say no, this is a nuclear negotiation. Period. Because everything from human rights to conventional arms is going to get thrown in there as an attempt to sort of undermine what is a very clear and distinct track. Now that said, let's get into some of these other issues. It seems to me that in some respects, right now, Iran and the U.S. have some very synchronized interests in the region. There's a very similar perception about ISIS. Certainly, Iran, if anything, has responded even more quickly to ISIS. And actually, unlike us, has a much more direct, like there actually are security implications for Iran because of ISIS.
Well, they share a border.
They share a border. They are and their sort of broader Shia community in the region is under threat because of ISIS. So that's one area. There's other areas where clearly, even though there's a difference in view, and certainly Iran has backed Assad in Syria fully, and even through all of his tremendous human rights abuses and in his efforts during that civil war. Now that said, we've have a great relationship with the Gulf states who clearly have put money into Nusra and ISIS, and it seems to me that there are issues like with Syria where even if we have a strong difference with Iran, it's crazy to not have Iran at a negotiating table in an attempt to reach settlements on these issues. So I guess when you talk about lowering, and then in Yemen, we're on the opposite side of Iran because we're basically backing Saudi Arabia and attacking Yemen because there's a group called the Houthis in Yemen, who's a Shia militia group, a Shia revolutionary group that is perceived to be backed by Iran. I think that that's not as clear-cut as some people think it is. I think it's a bit more organic. And the Saudis are engaging in a tremendous air campaign in Iran and Yemen that's causing a
humanitarian crisis,
a humanitarian catastrophe
humanitarian
that's
crisis.
barely even registering in the media right now. It's really horrific. And we're backing the Saudis. So, you have these different pieces of the chessboard where, we're aligned with Iran on ISIS. We have a disagreement about Syria, but any realistic policy in Syria is going to need to involve Iran, like it or not. And then in Yemen, frankly, we're backing a traditional ally in a really disastrous policy where we are, in fact, on the opposite side of Iran. And Iran might be adding to the temperature, but we're not responding in the right way. So there's all these ancillary issues, and I just want your kind of take on how we should think about those issues, how we should approach those issues in a way that acknowledge that obviously they're there, but isn't used as a cudgel to undermine these negotiations.
Definitely. Okay. So because you said a bunch of things there. So first,
absolutely. So take it part by part. Go ahead.
Well, so first, you mentioned kind of like the side issues that get thrown in, like human rights and terrorism and Iran's regional policies, and whether or not that should be germane to a conversation on the nuclear issue. I think it's certainly a conversation that should be had, but it definitely, I think we definitely both agree that should not preclude the U.S. and Iran and the other partners from achieving a deal. And there's a precedent for this also, because during Vietnam, there were Soviet-manned surface-to-air missiles shooting down U.S. pilots. The U.S. was bombing Soviet air defense, but Nixon still managed to negotiate the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I. Right. So it's not, so this has been done before, in which we have these broad
and with much larger stakes. I mean, and with
I mean, these were two superpowers ultimately. I think that for the U.S. decision-making process, those other issues certainly should still be on the table, but they should not be at the nuclear negotiating table. And I don't think they really are. I mean, I think there are some groups who are trying to kind of use them as a pretext to object to the nuclear talks, and I don't think that's really shifting the approach of our negotiators, at least. It may be shifting the approach of some members of Congress, but in terms of Kerry and Obama, I don't think they're letting themselves lose sight of it. So, and then in terms of like the broader regional implications of all of this, want to be clear about it, but I also don't want to exaggerate it at the same time, because even, if, let's say, next week they come out and have a comprehensive nuclear deal, Iran sticks to it to the T, sanctions, the nuclear-related sanctions are removed. As we both kind of alluded to, there are still a lot of other issues that separate the U.S. and Iran. So they are certainly far from becoming allies as a result of this. The U.S. will continue to see Iran as an anti-American revolutionary state. Iran will continue to see the United States as an imperial state that wants to overthrow, that would, like to see regime change in Iran. But there is some area for common ground, and in particular, ISIS, the fight against ISIS, stability in Iraq, stability in Afghanistan, the free flow of energy supplies. Even on Syria, they are clearly not on the same side of this fight, and Iran has backed Bashar al-Assad, because they have their own foreign policy driven by their own strategic interests too, and that has to do with a longer history of Iran's role in the region, and really started with the fact that during the immediate aftermath of the Islamic Revolution, every one of the states in the region supported Saddam Hussein in his really brutal fight with Iran, except for Syria. So there is kind of a long-standing
and Syria is a pipeline for Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon, which is also
absolutely yes, absolutely true as well. But as I understand it, Iran is continuing to back Assad. But if they were brought into the negotiating table, some of them have stated that they back Assad, but they don't back him to any means whatsoever. Meaning that if they're willing to see a change in leadership in Syria, but they don't want to see a vacuum take place there too.
And they're right about that. And a leadership that would protect Alawites and Shias, which is a very important dimension of what's happening there. So they're right about that.
Right, because if Assad was just removed and you had a vacuum there, I think that would be disastrous for everyone in the region, and the United States as well. So Syria is definitely a very complicated issue, and Iran is a major stakeholder in it. And I think the only way to get to a negotiated settlement there, which I'm not particularly optimistic about, I have to say, is inviting all stakeholders to the table.
Right. Absolutely.
Is there anything else we wanted to cover as well? I mean, we should maybe talk about Israel too, like in the implications for Israel as well.
Yeah. I mean, we only have like a minute or two left. I mean, if you want to touch on Israel, I think I guess. I think that in some ways the same dynamic in Israel exists as well, where actually if you talk to the realists in Israel, who might have a little bit, they might be generally a bit more hawkish, but I think that amongst the realists and the actual security people, there's an understanding of this deal is a good idea, and I think the question kind of is, is this just sort of crass domestic politics at this point with Netanyahu, or is this because it's just very poorly calibrated? In other words, he could have, if he had hugged the administration through this process and been respectful, his concerns and his sharper lines, if he even has them, because I think that's the other kind of part of this, is that I don't think there's any lines for negotiation with him around this. But if he wanted a tougher negotiating stance and he hugged Obama, he would have probably been even more part of this process. So I don't know. I mean, what else do you think is important to add about Israel and all of this?
No, I think you got everything. Yeah. There is actually, I want to make one quick point. I know you want to wrap this up. This is such an important point because there's been, I just sense a lot of intellectual dishonesty in the discourse in the United States, and a lot of not very good reporting and framing of this entire issue. So two things. I mean, first, just for your listeners out there, I just want to recommend that they check out a lot of what Nima Shirazi has been doing on his blog. So if you just Google his name, it's been fantastic, like investigative reporting. He actually reads the reports and can kind of break down a lot of these myths that are unfortunately just so pervasive in the discourse right now.
Nima,
But one of the
Nima's
most
important person to read. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
He's pretty much always right on these issues, and unfortunately, I think if more people would read, that type of reporting, this huge nuclear issue would not have metastasized to the extent that it has, because
Right.
it's really been exaggerated. But the main myth that I really want to dispel here is this argument that sanctions, these these biting sanctions, were what brought Iran to the nuclear table, because that's just patently not true. Iran cares about removing sanctions, certainly, but Iran's been at the table since 2003, 2002, 2003. I mean, Iran was at the table for a long time negotiating on this. There's two reasons I see why this latest round is proving more successful than previous rounds. Number one, for the past, for 8 years you had Ahmadinejad, and his rhetoric was ridiculous.
Right.
And just from an optical perspective, the U.S. couldn't have been openly negotiating with him.
Right.
They did privately, right? They did have secret talks with him with his people in Oman, by the way. But much more importantly, and this doesn't get talked about by the Washington Post or even the New York Times, who I think have been somewhat disingenuous on this, is that the U.S. shifted from years, almost a decade of a policy of zero enrichment to finally a policy of limited enrichment. And it's once that shift took place, which really is not a concession either. I mean, this is outlined. I think, again, your listeners should read the NPT and look at Article 4 of the NPT, which outlines Iran's inalienable right to produce nuclear power for peaceful purposes. So that's not really a concession to say that, that the U.S. shifted from a position of zero enrichment to limited enrichment. Right. And that, I think, is so important, because if you start, and I'll wrap this up, but if you start from the point that you think that sanctions are what brought Iran to the table, then that leads to a very dangerous conclusion, which is that, we should just ratchet up sanctions. The historical record does not bear that out at all, and I think that needs to be a much bigger part of the discussion.
I think they've been I think certain factions within both sides have been seeking some type of deal and had some sense that this dynamic does not work. I think arguably even with Rafsanjani since the late 80s, early 90s, and even somewhat during Ahmadinejad. You're absolutely right. And there's a lot of homework for the listeners that you've given them, Kayvon. They have to read the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They have to read the Iranian Constitution. We're keeping it very highbrow here today. I hope everybody has a July vacation coming up so they can catch up on this stuff. But Kayvon Afshari, my friend, my colleague at the American Iranian Council, I think you did a great job breaking this down for everybody, and I really appreciate your time.